Join me for an exciting webinar with Supply Chain Brain featuring trade experts from Thomson Reuters, Ernst & Young, and Georgia Pacific. We'll explore key insights from Thomson Reuters' 2023 State of Global Trade Report, provide valuable tips on leveraging global trade technology to support your talent, and discuss the expanding responsibilities of ESG reporting in the supply chain.
Fraser, how can I do this with no snare?
I don't know. I don't feel appropriately introduced. Welcome to Freightonomics, the show where we combine supply chain, global freight market information with the macroeconomic environment. And this is going to be our second to last show of the year, Anthony Smith.
That's right. So we have a special market expert edition coming up next week. So definitely make sure you tune in for that one. But we have, Zach, we just can't end the year smoothly, can we?
No.
We can't just go into the Christmas season and just have a good time and just relax.
I know, right? So today's focus is going to be around geopolitical environment, specifically around the crisis out there in the Middle East. That region, of course, continues to be an area of concern, and of course, tons of impacts to the global supply chain environment. We haven't necessarily seen that manifest yet, but we're bringing on Henry Byers today to talk that through. But first up, I want to make sure that we get to thank our sponsor.
That's right.
Thomson Reuters. The 2023 Global Trade Survey Report from Thomson Reuters is here, and you don't want to miss this. Navigate the ever-changing trade environment with insights into hot topics like skills gap, ESG reporting, ongoing and upcoming industry developments, and more by getting your free copy today. Download now at the link on your screen. And I did tell you that I downloaded.
Yeah, Zach approved.
Yeah, Zach approved. The skills gap. Yeah, the skills gap thing is fascinating to me.
Yeah.
That one is, you know, there's such a disparity between like the job requirements and like people coming out with the appropriate skills. I think that's an interesting trend to watch in America for sure.
Yeah, and I think another one is, of course, we always talk about as, you know, kind of just jumping into skills before we go and, of course, market into then definitely the big top stories for the day. Trades are a big one that needs a huge demand. And of course, with retirement, a lot of baby boomers, those trades usually have apprenticeships, and the lack of apprenticeships that are available because a lot of baby boomers are leaving, and then the lack of interest in some of the trades makes it all very messy. So if you're a youngster out there, if you have a youngster in your life, trades might be a good way to go.
Yeah, I talked to a few people that have gone the trade route recently. It's very stable environment too. If you're into that, the labor market of course, remarkably resilient this year. If you think about where we were expecting it to go, and so that skills gap situation definitely a trend to watch in 2024 without doubt. So, Anthony, let's lead it off with a market in two if you want to count me in, and then we'll get to the meat.
3, 2, 1, go.
All right. First up today, the outbound tender volume index. The demand scenario that we've been talking about being a little bit more resilient than we thought it was. Just like that labor market still remains elevated over the previous year's value. If you're looking at that green line, that's 2022's tender volume index. We are still well above that, though trending downward as we seasonally do. A little bit sharper decline here over the last couple of days. Probably going to continue that all the way into the new year. This is standard procedure. Still, though, I think that gap between last year and this year is still quite interesting to me. Let's move on to the next one. And this demand elevation year over year, the outbound tender rejection index, has not really manifested this demand side situation really significantly. Tender rejection rates are now right on par with where they were this time last year, just a skosh below 4%. It's on its way up. However, and we do think that it will increase into the year. I think the interesting thing to me, where does this index end up around Christmas? If we surpass last year, that's a sign of movement in the capacity side towards a little bit more equilibrium. But for now, extremely loose market, and it's continuing to be so. Let's go to the next one here. NTIL, our measure of dry van spot rates. This is a fascinating one. Spot rates are actually moving down and continue to kind of flatline. This is the point where we typically see spot rates start to increase, and they're not doing that. They're kind of hovering. They're still elevated over where they were most of the fall situation, but they're not moving higher quickly. You can see the trend line here is a little divergent to the previous couple of years. We still have another day or two before we start to see these things really start to increase. And last but not least, let's go to the next one. WRI chart. Looking at the top left, those are going to be your markets to watch for you brokers out there, transportation service providers. Those are the ones that are having the most disruption. Harrisburg leading the way. And interestingly enough, Salt Lake City.
Ding, ding. So Zach, jumping into it, okay, real quick here. Some of those charts that you had in, of course, here into one of the big things, of course, knowing that volumes aren't the problem here. Still a lot of capacity. And it's interesting to see in that OTRI, that tracing that's going on those year-over-year levels, on, I should say, that seasonality, kind of showing that there is maybe some life there.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting that the spot market is as dead as it is in terms of rate movement. Some of that, I thought that the mixing component would actually be a little bit more towards this ad hoc, direct-to-spot market expedited freight. That doesn't appear to be really making a big dent. It may be doing that, but it looks like maybe some carriers out there are more desperate than I thought they might be, just grabbing loads at whatever rate they can get at this point.
Yeah, and this is anything to just not sit empty or, stay still. And so we also have, of course, some top stories with, of course, the Red Sea, but we have someone here that is
let's lead the way with
genius.
The man, the myth, the legend, Henry Byers, our maritime expert. Thank you so much for joining us, Henry, to talk through the ongoing crisis in the Middle East. Now, just to outline for those of you that aren't familiar, or maybe you haven't been keeping up with it, there were attacks in the Middle East. Please go check out Greg Miller's articles that we also will probably reference in here a few times as we talk things through with Henry, outlining what's going on. There have been attacks on container ships specifically. Tankers are at risk, but not as much at risk as the container ships going on out there, as the Houthi rebels out there in Yemen are sieging attacks on these container ships. And of course, Houthi are backed by Iran, which is a Russian ally. And they're obviously trying to create some sort of disruption in the global space. And we could make a whole show about the geopolitical implications of what goes on in the Middle East. But I think for the purposes of today's show, Henry, kind of outline from your perspective how you see this disruption manifesting and how you see its like potential manifesting here over the next coming weeks.
Well, I think as far as the container space is concerned, I think, what's happened with, carriers routing around the Cape of Good Hope. I think that's something that will continue, at least in the short term. And so when you look at that, I mean, obviously transit time. So then you think about everything that travels from Asia to Europe, or anything that was heading through the Suez Canal is obviously going to be delayed by 7 to 14 days. And it's not that significant as far as the transit time alone, but it's just what occurs now. Once you have a disruption of like this, it's, things build up on either side, and it just, it has potential to get bigger if anything else is to occur, or it is to exacerbate in any format. I think we could see things like the U.S. West Coast as an example, some disruption there based on, how these things will all, rearrange as a result. So you got shippers really thinking about risk now, obviously on the heels of everything that's happened over even the last 5-6 years, from the trade war to COVID. to the West Coast port congestion, potential labor strikes, et cetera, they're certainly completely they're on their toes on this one. They're probably as prepared as ever for a potential disruption or black swan event, depending on who you ask. But I think it's really something that could certainly cause some constraints in places you may not expect right off the bat.
And Henry, we're looking at this lane essentially. We're looking at, or I should say, the traffic coming out of this area. Right now, are you looking at it being more impactful for Europe, or is it something that's going to be more impactful for the U.S., or is there going to be some type of a split here?
Undoubtedly, it's going to be weighted towards Europe. You're looking at everything that's flowing from Asia to Europe, and obviously some of that material that's going to Europe is then imported to the U.S. So there is some disruption. I'm not going to say the U.S. is completely independent in terms of being unaffected, but Europe's definitely more exposed here. All the freight that was being routed through the Suez heading from Asia to Europe is now going around the Cape of Good Hope. So if you're looking at the U.S., this is why I say the U.S. West Coast, because you're thinking about, okay, the Panama Canal, let's just go ahead and say that, that's also going on simultaneously. So you're looking at freight that was, already there was a natural rerouting back to the West Coast, but then you had the Panama Canal, and now if you have this, so you have people that were now trying to route to the East Coast of the U.S. through the Suez, now saying, okay, maybe this West Coast option is now becoming even more viable than it was, say, 2 to 3 weeks ago, as far as your exposure to any risks that may occur along that trade lane. And again, why I say that, very, very soon, you look 3 to 4 weeks in advance, out, depending on how robust Chinese New Year is, you could see quite a bit of volume hitting the West Coast of the U.S. And this is where we may start to see, some constraints happening from the capacity side, and obviously upwards pressure on those rates would be natural.
Yeah, we just had a chart up of the Freightos Baltic Exchange Index of rates going from the east and west, or from China to America's north, or east and west coast. The east coast rates there in the blue, and the west coast there in the white. Now, not a lot of activity on either one of those just yet, but we have had some semblance of upward pressure going to the East Coast earlier this month. And of course, that's the one that I think the Suez Canal probably impacts the most, correct, Henry? And then you're talking about the West Coast is where the predominance of the volume occurs, correct?
Well, exactly. And Zach, what you said there about just the stability of these rates has been very interesting, because, what ocean carriers like to do, and I think that, the market generally accepts this as a reason, is any excuse, you could say, for lack of a better term, that they can have to basically get away with, adding some surcharges or just kind of make the market feel like capacity is getting tighter. There's certain things that can affect capacity. I mean, these are true reasons. So they're going to definitely use them to their advantage. And so the Panama Canal, what was happening there is in terms of the surcharges that they're now adding to that route, because they're now, when things are constrained, costs tend to go up as far as, transiting these canals. And now you're looking at the Suez, and now you're looking at these war risk. War risk is a literal surcharge that occurs. So war risk is now coming into play. And so now you're looking at the East Coast rate, having some upward pressure just from generally what's being added from, carriers just to the cost of that transit, not necessarily demand. And why that's been interesting is then you have demand, shifting a little bit back to the West Coast. So you really have some nice pressure going on between each of these rates. And that's why you've seen stability when demand overall has been in decline since the peak, right? But now you have Chinese New Year coming into play. So now you have even this slight uptick in demand, adding a little bit more upwards pressure. And while I don't, expect to see, a huge surge, because again, demand would be the biggest driver of any, massive surge in rates. We do expect at this point to see some upwards pressure and some upwards tick on those rates, for it depends on how long this occurs, but it seems at least the next month or two, we'll have some decent upwards pressure on both of those rates, even though the East Coast is the most impacted in terms of how much volume it can support, and why, West Coast will probably surge a little bit higher just in terms of dollars amount if you're looking at the two. But really an interesting mix here. And I think for carriers, they're very they're not happy that the war's breaking out, but it's certainly from a pricing standpoint, they understand the need to try and take advantage of what they can in terms of those rate increases, because 2024 overall, as the outlook for demand is relatively weak and very comparable this year, probably even less than this year in terms of overall demand.
And here, I think you're doing a great job here outlining what are some of the immediate impacts. Can you talk about some of the long-term impacts here? Is this something that's going to be sticking in the minds of many and then really kind of help fuel some of that initiative that we've seen throughout much of 2023 of that nearshoring or reshoring initiative in the longer term here? Or do you think this will just be something that maybe is going to be impactful over the next month or so, and maybe this doesn't push forward the pace of that nearshoring or reshoring aspect?
I think you're exactly right to assume that. I mean, just think if you're a shipper, right, and you're toying with the idea of nearshoring, you're thinking about, okay, this seems obvious now that this is happening, this trend. How are we going to, use that to our advantage, et cetera? And then this occurs, and it certainly seems like it's not going away anytime soon as far as what's going on in the Middle East and the just geopolitical tensions overall. And so when you're thinking about that relative to nearshoring, saying, okay, well, the more we depend on others, the more we depend on, places that are increasingly exposed to this geopolitical tension. I mean, you were talking about China, you're talking about the Middle East. And so, very much so showing that, how connected we all are and how we have, been so connected through global trade for so long. And I think that, getting, Craig has even coined the term freedom trade. And I think, really what he means by that is that, looking at, places closer to home, but also, more of our allies, sourcing from countries that we can, depend on, being friends of the U.S. and nothing, happening in between, now at 5-10 years from now, to where we can make sure we're getting our material when we need it. And I think that's why Mexico becomes such a nice option for people, is because, or somewhere in Central or South America, is because, right now there's very little, if any. You're talking about maybe just the cartels in terms of risk to trade with Mexico. And it's reasonable to expect that would only get better if the more trade that occurs between us and Mexico.
Yeah, I want to circle back to the demand component you were talking about just a minute ago. And I want to bring up a chart, the IOTI. And it is, of course, the measure of bookings activity. This one is measuring more of the bookings from China to Europe lanes. And we really haven't seen a big uptick that's outside of expectation. This is the various load booking volume for 20-foot containers going from China to Germany, Netherlands, Italy. Or actually, this is just the one going to Germany. So this is the example that I pulled up to look at year over year over year. What is happening outside of expectation for demand? And it looks like we've actually saw an early surge in demand going into Germany, and now it's kind of pulled back a little bit. And we're not seeing any real strong acceleration outside of that early month uptick. Do you think that we have not really, people are starting to say, okay, this isn't going to be as big of a deal and not reacting as strongly? Do you think that's a downstream risk to supply chains in the future? Because I think one of Greg Miller's articles pointed out that it's going to require more capacity for these carriers to go around the Cape of Good Hope, because it's going to take longer transit. It's just going to require more ships, more, more ad hoc, ship movements. That's going to pull some capacity away from other lanes. Do you think that is an ongoing risk?
Well, I think, if you're talking about demand, what's really interesting here is that this is occurring when, Europe, if you're just looking at demand overall and the expectations moving forward, that's why I feel like absorbing a 7 to 14 day transit on your goods during a period where demand is relatively weak, or expected to be weak in the month, 2 months to come, adding that 7, it's not adding the transit time that disrupts, shippers, tremendously. It's typically the fact that they have already committed. And so if you had, demand that was elevated, you had more commitments on that delivery date, things would be a lot worse. But then also you're talking about now, shippers, are probably have better data than ever before as far as this transit time and how it's being disrupted. And I think, now again that it's occurring at a period where things aren't expected to be, as demand's not expected to be, exceed expectations. It's supposed to be relatively weaker or weaker in the even. Who knows what 2024 holds as far as that's concerned. But adding that on, I don't think it will be a massive disruption for these European shippers. And I think, again, if you're looking at how most of the stuff that was hitting the East Coast from Indian subcontinent and Asia that was traveling through the Suez, now you're just either adding on that transit time, because that when you're adding 7 to 14 days on what you already added, you're already like prepared for that. But then also the West Coast, again, as far as timing is concerned, now becomes a real nice option. And this mini land bridge with the rails, they're obviously incentivizing that quite a bit. And so I think it's about as attractive as ever for some of these people, these shippers, to ship to the West Coast and just completely bypass all of this risk. But you can only do that for so long, right? If demand upticks significantly, we're going to be in a nasty scenario there on the West Coast. So there's a lot of things that we have to factor in. The Panama Canal and how long that drought occurs is obviously one, but it's going to be interesting to see what happens.
Definitely, and kind of looking at, the mindset of a lot of shippers out here. Henry, you talk to, though it seems like there was a lack of a sense of urgency kind of coming into this holiday season initially, and then kind of going into, of course, we have to think about Chinese New Year coming up here, usually a pull forward around that. What does this all kind of mean in terms of where inventory levels are right now? Because it seems like a lot of folks are kind of moving back from that just in case to just in time. Do you see this kind of moving back into maybe we're going to need to get back into that just in case scenario if this does happen to be prolonged?
It all depends on how demand reacts, in my opinion. I think, there's just so much with the U.S. economy that could go wrong in the next 3 to 4 months. This could all add some pressure in the right way where you're certainly, right to assume that shippers can be pushed back into that. But I think, what's going on right now, if it was impacting, Asia, Indian subcontinent to the West Coast, is where I think the problems will really start to arise. And that may happen pretty quick, right? If, demand were to uptick in a significant way for whatever reason, I can't really see, cutting interest rates by, a point is going to really do that. But who knows where we're going to be in 4 to 5 months? There's a lot of things. Some people would argue there's some pretty massive bubbles out there. So if those were to pop, obviously demand, it's not going to help demand at all. But on the heels of that, who knows about a stimulus? We've all been so incredibly surprised by how resilient the consumer has been and how resilient the labor market has been in just the economy overall. I think there's just there's a lot of risk on that side. So when you're looking at inventories, I think continuing to run them lean, I think is going to make sense for most. I think the worst thing they feel like they could do at this point is just overreact, and that's why everyone's looking for the U.S. and its allies to step up and resolve what's going on there in the Red Sea, because it's just one of those things where if the dollar is being backed by the world reserve currency is being backed by the U.S. Navy and the U.S. military and NATO, its allies across the world. We want to see a strong response here to get this back under control, because I think it just doesn't set a nice precedent, moving forward. As far as how we can really rely on container carriers being able to depend on the military in that sense to kind of make sure that free trade continues. So it's one of those things where just in case, just in time inventories, I think you just continue to run your supply chains a little leaner than normal, and that's mostly because of the outlook for demand. I think that just is just something you can't deny at this point, is that if you were to build up inventory significantly, you may be sitting in a really, really tough spot if demand were to move to the downside significantly in 2024, which I think there's a lot of cases to be made that could happen.
So I'm looking at Sonar Container Atlas Ocean TEU transit times right now, and I just wanted to check because we measure the average transit time between port pairings coming to the United States. And the transit time to the West Coast is pretty flat. It's about 15 days on average right now. And the one going to to New York, New Jersey, Shanghai to New York, New Jersey, is up to about 32 and a half days. Now, that's up about 2 days year over year. It's up about a day month over month. Do you think that this is at a significant risk to get higher here over the next few weeks?
I'd say absolutely. This is why I say that it's going to be really interesting to see, because then what you're looking at there is also what the carriers are saying as far as what they're able to commit to on that transit time. And it's going to be interesting to see what ends up happening to the East Coast as far as like what those full transits are. And so they're also going to be weighing, like, you've had these ships reroute, but you haven't had a lot of freight depart from origin yet that has had this routing taken into consideration. So yes, what you're going to have is you're going to have an uptick on those the routes that are going to now go through the Cape of Good Hope. But as far as where those will end up, I think it's reasonable to expect you could see between 7 and 10 days uptick on that route specifically. If it is now looking at solely the freight that's transiting to the East Coast across the Cape of Good Hope.
Yeah, I want to bring up the IOTI for national, like United States, real quick, because I think this is an important contextual piece. You had it right before. The IOTI season year over year. So this is going into the United States, all freight, all import bookings going to the United States. And we talked about how resilient demand has been. It's down off of peak. We saw if you're looking at the white line there, that's down for Golden Week in China. It's a big impactor, but it's been sort of holding. And of course, we normally see a dip in the winter months, and then it rises heading into Chinese New Year or Lunar New Year month. What's your read here? Like, I don't see any significant reaction to the Suez situation. Do you?
No, and I don't think you're going to. I just think that even with what moves pre-Chinese New Year, a lot of this volume during this part of the year doesn't have the urgency around it. Even a lot of the stuff that moves pre-Chinese New Year is looking at, making sure it lands in the country by, the proper, prelude to spring, summer months. A lot of the, as Americans, consumers start to get back outdoors and start those type of projects and activities, it's typically, skewed towards that type of freight. So the urgency around that freight is still, relatively low. And you can see that a lot by looking at the lead times that we possess in Container Atlas. So I think all things considered, until that urgency, gets higher. And so this is where, now, even though demand's staying relatively stable, I just don't see any, strong reaction. But I think everybody's on their toes. Again, everybody's on, really focusing on anything that could cause a disruption. And I think that's good. It's good to see people concerned. They should be concerned. I think especially when you look at the Middle East, it could certainly exacerbate. I mean, it could become a lot bigger than we ever anticipated. And this is why I've always kept this on any of my calls or any of my info to clients is you've got to be considering the geopolitical tensions that are escalating or seemingly escalating. And I think, so if you were doing that properly, this is something that you had on the bingo card, you could say. But I think just as far as, a reaction to pulling in volumes or front loading, like you typically may see if this were going into peak season, just not really thinking I'm going to see that this year, even pre-Chinese New Year volume, because again, if this were occurring from Asia to the U.S. and affecting either the West Coast, even with the Panama Canal, if this was happening in Panama, as far as a war breaking out, I think it may be a little bit stronger reaction. But it's just that U.S. West Coast is ready. They've been battle tested again, and I think this labor strike's being resolved. I think you're going to see the quickest reaction in terms of what do we do now. Hey, let's just move this volume West Coast and let's just rail it as far as we possibly can, to the middle of the country, and we'll truck it from there. I think that's something that shippers are ready to do. I mean, you look at what's happened over the last 3 to 4 years with making sure you have proper DCs, proper warehousing on both coasts, a real nice diversified network. When you look at a certain area like this, in my mind, what's happened over the last 3 to 4 years as far as how shippers have reacted and adjusted and curtailed their supply chains, they perhaps may be, let's just say they have to be in one of the best positions here to navigate this without any significant disruption. But again, that's just saying where we are now. Where this goes, this could very well change as far as how big does this actually get as far as bringing in other parts of the world, or it just getting bigger in terms of, what it ends up impacting as far as like free trade alliances or, who knows where we go from here. But I think as it sits right now, I think we'll absorb at least this small skirmish here between the rebels and what's going on in the Red Sea. And I think the U.S. will step up. And I think we may see flow of containers going back through the Suez quicker than we expected. But if we don't, I think at least for the next 3 to 4 months, while demand stays relatively low, I don't think we're going to see a tremendous impact to U.S. shippers.
Henry, thank you so much for joining us and shedding some light here for what's going on. Always a pleasure to have you on. Hope to get you on a lot more in 2024 and hope you have an amazing holiday season.
Hopefully not because there's conflict.
Yeah, we can just talk general trends.
Yeah. Love when it happens during Christmas, right?
Yeah.
Always happy, guys.
Right. Thanks, Henry.
Zach,
wow.
No shortage of information there.
Right.
No shortage of activity going on in our market.
Yeah, I wish it wasn't. Yeah, I wish it wasn't Christmas when all this stuff was kind of blowing up like that is, but it is. And of course, we have a lot of data that's telling us the story, what to react to and what not to react to.
That's right. Get into Sonar, get into Container Atlas, drink more water.
Not very good.